A millionaire is walking alone to his luxury car when he's approached by a dangerous kidnapper who forces him toward a dark van, warning him to stay quiet if you don't want to get hurt. When the criminal grabs the businessman by the arm, the situation escalates dramatically, and he realizes he's being taken to an isolated location. At this critical moment, an 8-year-old girl emerges from the corner where she had been begging, holding a brick she found on the ground. With all the strength of her small body, she does something unbelievable. The raw, early Thursday morning air sliced through the fine wool of his expensive overcoat, a brutal contrast to the stuffy warmth of the boardroom Arthur Vance had just left. The negotiation had dragged on for hours, a ballet of numbers and clauses he conducted with a maestro's precision, but it had left his soul feeling hollow. His Italian leather shoes, normally silent on the plush carpets of his corporate empire, echoed with a ghostly loneliness in the deserted parking garage. The smell of damp asphalt and the pale glow of the few security lights created an atmosphere that felt alien to him, almost menacing. Arthur didn't belong in places like this, not at this hour. His world was one of mirrored glass, polished mahogany, and the gentle hum of success. Here, he was just a man, vulnerable beneath a starless sky. He quickened his pace toward his car, a luxury sedan that looked like a black panther sleeping amidst the grey concrete. The desire to get home, to sink into the comforting silence of his penthouse, was almost a physical ache. That was when a shadow moved near one of the support pillars. Arthur stopped, his heart giving an uncomfortable lurch in his chest. His mind, trained to assess financial risk, was slow to process physical danger. He frowned, thinking it was a night guard, maybe a late-working employee. But the figure that emerged wore no uniform. It was a burly man, his face obscured by a hoodie, and his eyes glinted with a predatory intensity that sent a chill down Arthur's spine. "Evening, Mr. Vance." The voice was hoarse, a rough whisper that tore through the silence. "You're coming with me, quietly, if you don't want to get hurt." Arthur froze. This wasn't real. It was a scene from a movie, something that happened to other people on distant news reports. He, Arthur Vance, the philanthropist, the man whose name was on charter schools and children's foundations, couldn't be the target of something so crude. The assailant lunged forward and grabbed his arm with a force that felt like it could crush bone. The touch was a jolt of reality, violent and grimy. "Let's go. The van's right over there." He was dragged along, his feet stumbling in a rhythm dictated by fear. The facade of control he had spent his entire life building crumbled in an instant. Now he was just fear, pure and paralyzing. The dark van, parked strategically near the garage exit, looked like an open mouth ready to swallow him whole. Across the street, huddled by a dumpster, a small figure watched. Leah, 8 years old, recognized the man in the nice coat. He was the man who every Tuesday and Thursday without fail would stop his elegant car and give her a shiny quarter and sometimes a pastry wrapped in a napkin. Her eyes, accustomed to the harshness of the streets, saw what no one else did, kindness being dragged into the dark. The man relaxed his guard for a second, yanking open the van door and shoving Arthur inside. In that instant of inattention, Leah acted. Her small, soot-stained hand closed around a loose brick from the sidewalk. There was no thought, only a ferocious instinct to protect the one source of gentleness in her desolate world. With the strength that survival had given her, she hurled the brick. The object flew through the silent night air and struck the assailant's head with a sickening, hollow thud. The man let out a grunt of pain, staggering sideways, completely disoriented. The hand holding Arthur loosened. The van door was still open. The world seemed to stop, suspended in a tense silence, broken only by Arthur's ragged breathing. He was free, staring at his collapsed attacker and then into the darkness from where his unexpected salvation had come. He could barely breathe. his brain trying to comprehend what had just happened when he saw a pair of huge, frightened eyes staring at him from behind a pillar. The sound of the brick hitting the man's skull had been sharp, an ugly crack that echoed in the garages. Silence. For a second, the three of them were frozen in a surreal tableau, the attacker slumping to the side, hand to his head, a glazed look of confusion in his eyes. Arthur, heart hammering against his ribs, feeling the cold rush of freedom, and the girl, Leah, a tiny, trembling silhouette behind the concrete pillar, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. The spell was broken by the man's groan. The instinct for self-preservation, buried by panic moments before, finally surfaced in Arthur. With a movement that surprised himself, he launched himself at the staggering assailant, using his body weight to bring him down to the pavement for good. He was not a fighter, but adrenaline gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He pressed his knee into the man's back as the man barely struggled and fumbled for his phone in his coat pocket with a shaking hand. The 911 operator's voice sounded distant, as if from another world. Arthur could barely form coherent sentences, babbling the address, talking about an attempted kidnapping, about a man on the ground. In minutes that felt like an eternity, the silence was shattered by the piercing wail of approaching sirens. Red and blue lights swept across the parking garage, painting the scene in hues of urgency and chaos. Police officers emerged from their patrol car, weapons drawn, and the situation, once a personal and silent nightmare, became an official procedure. As the officers handcuffed the now semi-conscious assailant, Arthur's adrenaline began to subside, replaced by an overwhelming wave of gratitude. His gaze swept the area and found the girl still huddled, ready to bolt at any moment. He approached slowly, hands raised, as one might approach a frightened animal. "Don't run," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. You saved me." Leah watched him, wary. Her hair was matted, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes held a startling clarity. Arthur pulled his wallet from his pocket. His mind, conditioned to solve problems with money, defaulted to its factory settings. "I want to thank you. I want to give you a reward. Anything, money, a home, food, whatever you want, it's yours." He held out a thick fold of $100 bills, enough to change anyone's life. The girl looked at the money, then at his face. She shook her head, a barely perceptible motion. In a shy voice, almost a whisper, she spoke the words that would dismantle Arthur's world. "You don't have to. You were always nice to me. I couldn't let the bad man take you." The simplicity of that statement hit him harder than the attack. This child, who had nothing, had acted not for hope of gain, but out of pure, genuine loyalty to a stranger who gave her pastries. He felt small, ashamed of his first reaction. He put the money away, the lump in his throat tightening. He saw now, with a painful clarity, that she had no idea of the gravity of what she had done. To her, it was a simple act of reciprocation. To the real world, it was a declaration of war against dangerous people. As he was thinking about how to protect her, the officers hauled the attacker to his feet to lead him to the patrol car. The man, now more alert, scanned the scene, and his gaze locked onto Leah. For an instant, a spark of pure hatred flared in his eyes. He leaned toward her, and before an officer shoved him into the car, his hoarse voice cut through the air with a hissing venom. "I know who you are, little rat, and I know where to find you." The assailant's words hung in the cold air, an invisible poison that seeped into Arthur's lungs. "I know where to find you." It wasn't a shout, but a whisper heavy with promise. Arthur saw Leah flinch, an instinctive recoil, but her face remained strangely impassive, a mask of street-forged resilience that was more disturbing than any tear. The officers pushed the man into the squad car and slammed the door with a metallic thud, but his threat remained, echoing in the silence that followed. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night's temperature. He looked at the girl, at her fragility and her unnerving strength, and a terrible certainty washed over him. The nightmare hadn't ended when he broke free. It was just beginning, and now she was at its center. At the precinct, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant hung in the air. The fluorescent lights hummed mercilessly, revealing the smudges on Leah's face and the profound exhaustion in Arthur's eyes. He gave his statement to a middle-aged sergeant, a woman named Miller, whose eyes conveyed a mixture of compassion and weariness. He recounted the facts with an executive's precision, but his voice wavered when he mentioned the criminal's final threat. "We'll file a report on the threat, Mr. Vance," Sergeant Miller said, jotting it down on a form. "But, to be honest, it's his word against yours. And with his record, it probably won't add much to his sentence. The important thing is he's in custody." "For how long?" Arthur pressed, his anxiety mounting. "Men like that don't stay locked up for long." The sergeant sighed, a sound that held years of frustration with the system. "We'll do our best. And the girl, she needs to be seen by Child Protective Services. We can have someone reach out in the morning." Arthur looked over at Leah, who was sitting in a plastic chair, her small legs barely touching the floor. She watched everything with a stillness that unnerved him. Child Protective Services, foster homes. He knew the system. He funded parts of it. He knew its slowness, its bureaucracy, the cracks through which children like Leah could fall. The threat wasn't for tomorrow morning. It was for now. When the procedures were finally over, it was past 4 a.m. Arthur knelt in front of Leah. "I'm going to take you home now, okay? You just tell me where it is, and my driver will take us." She met his gaze with her large, serious eyes. "I don't have a home." The simple sentence, delivered without a trace of self-pity, hit Arthur like a physical blow. He blinked, trying to process it. "What about your parents? Where are they?" "Don't have any," she replied, with the same casualness someone might say they don't have a coat. In that moment, Arthur Vance's world, built on pillars of logic, control, and detached philanthropy, crumbled. He didn't see a statistic or a case for social services. He saw a child, an 8-year-old hero who was utterly alone and had just painted a target on her back to save him. A wave of responsibility, as powerful and overwhelming as the fear he'd felt hours earlier, washed over him. He couldn't hand her over to a system that might protect her or might not. "Right," he said, his voice firm for the first time that night. "Then you're coming with me. We're going somewhere safe for now." He took her to a discreet hotel, far from his usual haunts. The girl was mesmerized by the elevator, the soft carpet, the big white bed. For a moment, Arthur felt a flicker of normalcy, the satisfaction of providing comfort. He left her in the room, locked the door, and stepped into the hallway to call his head of security, arranging for discreet surveillance on the location. When he returned a few minutes later, he saw something on the doormat in front of the room's door. He bent down, confused, and his blood ran cold. There, small and still, was a dead rat, carefully placed right in the center of the mat. The message was unmistakable. They already knew where she was. The dead rat on the doormat was a silent scream, a grotesque violation that turned the anonymous sanctuary of the hotel into an extension of the dark parking garage. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. How? How had they found her so quickly? Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He hadn't told anyone about this hotel except his head of security, a man he trusted implicitly. The thought of a betrayal, so close, so immediate, was inconceivable. But the evidence was there, still and macabre, just inches from where Leah slept. He quickly scooped up the animal with a tissue, disposed of it in a hallway trash can, and re-entered the room, the click of the lock sounding obscenely loud. Leah was fast asleep, curled up in the middle of the immense bed, looking even smaller and more vulnerable. Sleep, for her, was a rare and precious escape, and Arthur felt like a monster for knowing that the danger had followed her even here. He spent the rest of the night in an armchair, watching the door, his mind racing, trying to connect the dots of a terrifying puzzle. The attacker's network was faster, more efficient than he could have ever imagined. This wasn't the work of a lone criminal. This was organized. The next morning, he tried to mask his anxiety with a forced normalcy. He ordered a lavish room service breakfast, and Leah ate with an appetite that was both healthy and heartbreaking. She had never seen a croissant before, and her genuine delight in the flaky pastry was a stab to Arthur's heart. He was showing her a world of comforts, but he was also dragging her into the center of a nightmare. He needed to act, but he was out of his element. His power lay in boardrooms, in contracts, in financial influence. Against whispered threats and dead rats at hotel doors, his money felt like a paper shield. Still, it was the only weapon he knew. He called Helen, his lawyer and longtime friend, a pragmatic, sharp woman whose calm in a crisis was legendary. "Arthur, what happened? You sound terrible," she said. He summarized the night, his voice low so as not to wake Leah, who was now drawing on a hotel notepad. He told her about the kidnapping, the brick, the threat, and finally, the rat. A heavy silence settled on the line. "This is intimidation, Arthur," Helen said finally, her voice grave. "And it's well planned. They're testing you. They want to see how far you'll go to protect this girl. They know who you are. They know you have resources. Maybe they want money to leave her alone. I'll pay. Whatever it takes," Arthur said without hesitation. "It might not be that simple," Helen warned. "Paying could be seen as weakness. It could open the door for more extortion. We need to understand who we're dealing with. I'm going to hire a private investigator, someone discreet, who knows how to move in that world. In the meantime, get the girl out of there. Take her somewhere only you know. No security, no drivers, no one." The poison of suspicion entered his thoughts. His head of security, one of his drivers, someone in his company? The paranoia began to set in. He hung up and looked at Leah. She held up her drawing for him. It was a picture of a man in a nice coat and a little girl, holding hands under a smiling yellow sun. The innocence of it, in contrast with the sordid reality of their situation, nearly broke him. That evening, under the pretense of a walk, he took her to a makeshift shelter she had used before, a space under an old bridge, so she could retrieve some of her treasures, a collection of smooth stones and a one-eyed cloth doll. While she was crouched down, gathering her things, a rock hit the concrete wall just inches from her head, then another. They weren't large, but the message was clear. From the shadows on the other side of the river, Arthur saw two hooded figures watching, motionless. They didn't attack. They just watched. They were showing him they knew everything, that they could get close whenever they wanted. Leah flinched, her courage finally cracking. She looked at Arthur, her eyes filled with a terror he hadn't seen before. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. The sound of the rocks hitting the concrete was pointed and methodical, a macabre countdown. Arthur instinctively grabbed Leah's arm, pulling her back, shielding her with his own body. The figures across the river didn't move, two statues of ill omen against the faint city glow. They didn't need to get closer. The distance in that moment was a more powerful weapon, a demonstration of reach and control that made Arthur's blood run cold. They weren't there to attack. They were there to terrorize, to prove that no place was safe, not even the most secret refuges of a homeless child. Leah's bravery, which had seemed unshakable, finally broke. The tremor in her body was real, deep, and the look she gave him was a silent plea that pierced Arthur's soul. "We're leaving. Now," he said, his voice low and urgent. He led her away from the bridge, back toward the lighted streets, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every shadow seemed to hold an enemy, every anonymous pedestrian a potential threat. Paranoia, once a seed, now bloomed in his chest, thorny and suffocating. He took her to his own penthouse. It was a risky move, the most obvious place, but also the most fortified. A high-tech sanctuary with doormen, cameras, and 24/7 private security. Helen would have his head for the recklessness, but he needed a place where he could breathe, where he could feel, even for a moment, that he was in control. Leah's reaction upon entering the apartment was one of pure awe. The sprawling space, the floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the glittering city below, the luxurious silence. It was a different universe from anything she had ever known. She walked on the plush carpet as if treading on clouds, touching the cool surface of a marble sculpture with her fingertips. For a moment, the beauty of the place seemed to chase the fear away, but it was only an illusion. That night, whispers began to follow her. While Arthur was on the phone with the private investigator Helen had hired, a man named Cole, Leah came running from the living room, her face pale. "There are people calling me outside," she whispered, pointing to the balcony. Arthur frowned. "That's impossible, Leah. We're more than 30 stories up." "I heard them," she insisted, her eyes wide. "They said my name. They said they're waiting." He went to the balcony, his heart tight. He slid open the glass door and was met only by the howl of the wind between the skyscrapers. There was no one, nothing but the city's illuminated abyss. It was her imagination, the trauma manifesting itself, but as he turned to reassure her, he saw something on the balcony floor, near the railing. A single crow's feather, black and glossy, something that had no business being there. There were no nests, no trees at this height. It was another symbol, another message. They could get anywhere. Arthur's fortress of glass and steel was no more impenetrable than the space under the bridge. The days that followed were a psychological torture. Arthur tried to create a routine for Leah. He bought her new clothes, children's books, toys. He tried to fill the oppressive silence of the apartment with laughter, but the tension was palpable. The girl barely slept. She had nightmares and would wake up screaming. The shadows in the corners of the apartment seemed to move, and the wind sounded like threatening whispers. She began to refuse to be alone, even for a minute, trailing Arthur everywhere like a small shadow of fear. The situation reached a new level of cruelty one afternoon when, as they were watching a cartoon on television, Arthur's cell phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. There was no voice, only the sound of a recording. It was the lullaby Leah's mother used to sing to her, a tune she had hummed softly once when she thought Arthur wasn't listening. The childish melody, distorted and repeated in a sinister loop, was the vilest of threats. They weren't just following her, they were inside her head, using her most precious memories as a weapon. Arthur hung up, his face a mask of fury and impotence. Leah, who had heard the melody, began to sob quietly, tears streaming down her face. She curled up on the sofa, hugging her knees, completely devastated. The last safe refuge, her own memories, had been invaded. The distorted lullaby was the final straw. The cruelty of the act broke. Something inside Arthur, the helplessness he felt, curdled into a cold, sharp anger. He looked at Leah, curled up on the sofa, her small body racked with silent sobs, and realized he was fighting the wrong war. His fortresses were of glass and steel, his armies of lawyers and executives. But his enemies fought with shadows, whispers, and stolen memories, and they were winning. He had to change the rules of the game, and fast. He called Cole, the private investigator. "I don't want reports anymore. I don't want discretion. I want answers, and I want them now." Arthur said, his voice low but vibrating with an intensity that surprised Cole himself. Money is no object. Use every resource. I want to know who these people are. I want to know how they know everything. I want the name of the person at the top. Cole, a jaded ex-cop who thought he'd seen it all, felt a chill. Mr. Vance, you understand that to get that kind of information, I'll have to stir up some dangerous nests? This could draw more attention, not less. They're already on my balcony and on my phone. I already have their attention. What I don't have is a name for my enemy. Get me a name, Cole, Arthur commanded, then hung up. His frustration with official channels also hit its peak. He went to the precinct again, this time with Helen. He presented the dead rat, the crow's feather, the call log with the lullaby. Sergeant Miller listened with sympathy, but her hands were tied. Mr. Vance, I understand your anguish, I really do. But all of this, it's circumstantial evidence. Intimidation is a difficult crime to prove without a direct threat, without a witness. A rat could be a pest. A feather could be the wind. A phone call could be a sick prank. Legally, we don't have enough to act. So you're going to wait until something happens to her? Arthur exploded, losing his composure. You'll wait until they actually hurt her to have something concrete? Those are the rules of the system we work in, the sergeant said, exhaustion plain in her voice. Arthur left the precinct feeling trapped. The legal system, the pillar of the society he so trusted, was a paper fortress, too slow and bureaucratic. To protect a child in imminent danger, he was on his own in this, he and Leah. This realization forced him to make a drastic decision. He had to get her out of the city, disappear. He had a country house, a secluded lodge in the Catskills, a place no one in his professional circle knew about. He'd bought it years ago on an impulse and had barely ever visited. It was the perfect hiding place. He packed a bag hastily, grabbing only the essentials. He told Leah they were going on a trip, an adventure. The girl, despite her constant fear, seemed to brighten at the idea of leaving the apartment that had become a gilded cage. As they were preparing to leave, the doorman buzzed on the intercom. "Mr. Vance, there's a delivery for you down here. A small package." "I didn't order anything," Arthur replied, suspicious. "It's from a florist, sir. A gift for your little visitor is what the delivery man said." Arthur's blood ran cold. "Don't accept it. Send it back. Don't accept anything." He hung up, panic seizing him. They knew she was there. They knew his plans to leave. He ran to the window, peering down at the street below. And then he saw him. Across the avenue, an ordinary-looking man holding a bouquet of flowers stared directly up at his window. When their eyes met, the man raised his free hand and gave a slow, deliberate wave, as if to a child. Then he let the bouquet drop to the sidewalk, turned, and melted back into the crowd, disappearing. The gesture wasn't friendly. It was an assertion of omnipresence, a reminder that they were everywhere, and that running wouldn't be as easy as he thought. The man with the flowers vanished into the crowd, but his image was seared into Arthur's mind, a smiling spectre in the city's hustle. That wave, so casual from so far away, was more terrifying than any direct threat. It was a display of power, of total surveillance. The message was clear: there is nowhere to run. We are watching your every move. The trip to the Catskills, which moments before had seemed like a solution, now sounded like a trap. Taking Leah to an isolated place could mean simply cornering themselves, far from any possible help. The city, with its crowds and anonymity, suddenly felt like the safer hiding place. Arthur stepped back from the window, his heart racing. He looked at the packed bags on the floor, at Leah's expectant face. The promise of an adventure now tasted like a bitter lie. He couldn't risk it. Not like this. The change in plans had to be immediate and radical. He was playing chess against an opponent who was always 3 moves ahead. It was time to flip the board. "Change of plans, Leah," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're not going on a trip anymore. I have a better idea." His plan was born of desperation and a sudden clarity. If he couldn't hide from them, he would drag them into the light. He would use the one weapon they wouldn't expect from him: public exposure. Arthur Vance was a private man. His philanthropy was quiet, his media appearances rare and controlled. He guarded his privacy as zealously as he guarded his investments. Now he would sacrifice it. He called Helen. "I want to call a press conference today, as soon as possible." Helen was silent for a moment. "Arthur, what are you thinking? This is the opposite of what we discussed. Exposing the girl, exposing the situation. This could put her in even more danger." "They already know everything, Helen. They're toying with us. Darkness is their playground. I'm going to turn on all the lights," he said, the determination in his voice unshakable. "I'm going to tell the whole story. The kidnapping, her courage, the threats. I'm going to put her face on every newspaper, every TV channel. I'm going to make her the most famous child in the country. They won't be able to touch her in the shadows anymore because there won't be any shadows. There will be floodlights." It was a colossal gamble, an all-or-nothing move. It could protect her by making her untouchable in the court of public opinion, or it could paint an even bigger target on her back. But inertia was the worst option. The press conference was hastily arranged in the lobby of one of his company's buildings. Journalists, drawn by the rare appearance of the reclusive billionaire, packed the room. Arthur took the podium, Leah at his side, holding his hand tightly. The girl, dressed in new clothes, looked frightened by the camera flashes, but she lifted her chin, a spark of her old bravery shining in her eyes. Arthur told the story. His voice, normally calm and measured, was thick with emotion. He described the attack, Leah's courage, and then bluntly detailed the campaign of psychological terror that followed. He didn't name names, but he painted a vivid picture of a criminal organization that operated through fear. "This girl is a hero," he declared, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "And for her act of bravery, she is being hunted. I am here today to say that she is no longer alone. Anyone who tries to harm her will no longer be facing a defenseless child. They will be facing me, and they will be facing the eyes of this entire city." The story exploded. It was the headline on every news site. The image of Leah, small and defiant next to the magnate, was everywhere. The public embraced her cause with fervor. The girl with the brick, the little hero. Arthur's plan seemed to have worked. The exposure had created a shield of notoriety. That night, exhausted but with a new sense of hope, they were getting ready for bed. Arthur finally felt like he had regained control. That's when Cole called. His voice was tense, urgent. "Mr. Vance, I found something. The call with the lullaby. We traced the source. It didn't come from a burner phone or a payphone. The signal, it came from inside your building." Cole's revelation fell on Arthur like a slab of concrete. "From inside your building." The words echoed in his mind, shattering the fragile sense of security the press conference had built. The enemy wasn't just outside, watching through the windows. He was within the walls, breathing the same air. The sanctuary, the fortress, was an illusion. The betrayal was close, intimate. Every familiar face in the building, doormen, security guards, cleaning staff, neighbors, instantly became a suspect. Paranoia, once a generalized anxiety, now sharpened to a fine, painful point. He looked at Leah, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, exhausted from the turbulent day. The public exposure he had orchestrated to protect her now seemed like a double-edged sword. He had made her famous, yes, but he had also publicly confirmed her location, placing her center stage in a theater where one of the actors was a traitor hiding in plain sight. Anger gave way to a cold fear. He had grossly underestimated the reach and infiltration of his adversaries. "Cole, who?" Arthur whispered into the phone, walking to the farthest corner of the apartment as if the walls themselves might be listening. "I don't know yet," the investigator replied. "The signal was triangulated to the building, but the precision isn't enough to pinpoint an apartment or a specific floor. It could be anyone, an employee with access, a resident. It could even have been someone who piggybacked off a resident's Wi-Fi network. What this tells us, Mr. Vance, is that they have resources and technical know-how. These are not amateurs." Arthur hung up, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He walked to the massive window, staring down at the city below. The lights that once symbolized his success now seemed like a million watching eyes. He felt like a fish in a bowl, every move exposed. The relationship with Leah also began to deepen and complicate. Their shared trauma and forced proximity had forged a powerful bond. He was no longer just a benefactor. He was her sole protector, the only constant in her chaotic world. And she, to him, had become more than a responsibility. Her resilience, her stubborn innocence in the face of terror, was a source of strength he hadn't known he needed. He began to teach her to read, spending hours sitting on the floor with colorful children's books. In these small islands of normalcy, the fear seemed to recede. Leah was a quick study, absorbing knowledge with the same intensity with which she absorbed life. She started calling him Arthur, no longer Mr., and the subtle shift in her tone carried a weight of familiarity and trust that both warmed and terrified him. He was growing attached to her in a way that left him vulnerable. The fear of losing her was now a personal terror, not just a moral imperative. The challenges, however, grew more complex. Leah's sudden fame attracted not only sympathy but also the scrutiny of the media and social services. Social workers began making regular visits, questioning Arthur's suitability as a temporary guardian. They were professionals, doing their jobs, but every question about his past, about his fitness to care for a child, felt like an indictment. He, the man who controlled an empire, now had to prove he was fit to be a father. The external pressure was relentless, but the internal pressure was worse. One night, Leah woke from a nightmare, screaming. Arthur rushed to her room to find her sitting up in bed, trembling. "I dreamed about the bad man," she sobbed. "He wasn't alone. There was another man with him. A man I know." Arthur sat beside her, his heart tight. "Who, Leah? Who was the other man?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know his name, but I've seen him before. He worked in the building where you have your big office. He cleaned the floors." Leah's revelation hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. He cleaned the floors. An anonymous figure, a face in the crowd of staff who moved through his empire daily. Someone he had likely passed dozens of times in the hallways without ever registering his existence. The betrayal wasn't just close. It was invisible, hidden, in plain sight. The criminal network didn't need sophisticated hackers or high-level corporate spies. They had something far more effective. The overlooked man, the one who hears everything because no one ever notices him. The one who would know his schedules, the meeting rooms, the garage he used. The one who could have planted the crows, a feather on his balcony, or made the call from a co-worker's unattended phone. "Are you sure, Leah? Try to remember his face," Arthur urged, his voice controlled despite the urgency he felt. Leah closed her eyes, her small face scrunched in concentration. He was tall, and he had a little scar near his eye. He was always whistling a song, the same song. She began to hum a simple, out-of-tune pop song that Arthur vaguely recognized. The description was thin, but it was more than he'd had. It was a thread to pull. The next morning, he didn't go to the office. He sent a message to his COO requesting, under some vague pretext, the complete list and ID photos of all third-party cleaning staff from the last 6 months. When the file arrived in his inbox, he opened it with his heart in his throat. He sat with Leah in front of the computer screen. "We're going to play a game," he said, trying to sound casual. "A memory game. You tell me if you recognize any of these faces." He scrolled through the photos slowly, one by one. There were dozens of faces, men and women of all ages, most with tired smiles or neutral expressions for the ID camera. Leah stared intently, shaking her head no at each one. Arthur began to feel his hope dwindle. Maybe it was just a nightmare, a creation of her traumatized mind. Then he stopped on one photo, a tall, middle-aged man with a vacant stare. And there, almost imperceptible in the low-resolution image, was a small white scar next to his left eye. Before Arthur could say a word, Leah's finger shot out and tapped the screen. "That's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's him." The name on the file was Ricardo Diaz. Hired 5 months ago. Clean record. No red flags. A ghost. Arthur felt a chill. He forwarded the photo and name to Cole immediately with a single instruction: find him. The discovery, instead of bringing relief, deepened the chasm of distrust. If a janitor was an informant, how many others could there be? How high up did the rot go? He started looking at his closest executives, his assistants, even Helen, his friend, with a sliver of doubt. Trust, a pillar of his life and his business, was crumbling. This erosion of trust began to affect his relationship with Leah. He became overprotective to a suffocating degree. He restricted their outings even more, installed more cameras, monitored every person who entered or left the building with a feverish obsession. Leah, who had started to blossom under his care, began to wilt again. The gilded cage was becoming just a cage. "Don't you trust anyone, Arthur?" she asked one day, with the blunt wisdom only a child possesses. They were on the balcony, now screened in with newly installed security netting, and he had stopped her from waving to a child in the neighboring building. The question caught him off guard. "I trust you, Leah," he replied, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "No," she said, looking him in the eye, "you're scared, and your fear is locking me in here." Her words were like a mirror, reflecting a truth he didn't want to face. He, the powerful man, was being ruled by fear, and in his desperate attempt to protect her, he was suffocating the very life he was trying to save. That same night, Cole called with news. He had a lock on Ricardo Diaz, and what he'd found was far more shocking than Arthur had expected. Diaz wasn't just an informant. He was the older brother of the man Arthur had subdued in the parking garage, the man Leah had hit with the brick. Anfidi, revenge wasn't just about a foiled kidnapping. It was personal. It was a matter of family. The news that Ricardo Diaz was the brother of the original kidnapper, Marcos, changed everything. This was no longer an impersonal, greedy criminal organization reacting to an interference in their business. It was a vendetta, a family wound that was bleeding hatred and demanded retribution. Arthur felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He and Leah hadn't just stumbled into a criminal operation. They had crashed into the brick wall of a twisted and dangerous family loyalty. It explained the persistence, the psychological cruelty, the personal nature of the threats. Each act of intimidation wasn't just a warning, but a punishment. "Where is he, Cole?" Arthur asked, his voice tense. "Vanished," the investigator replied. "He quit his job the day after the press conference, cleaned out his locker, and disappeared. The address he gave on his employment forms is a fake. He's a ghost, just like his brother probably was before he got nabbed. A ghost with a grudge. The thought was terrifying. Arthur looked over at Leah, who was drawing in a corner of the room, oblivious to the conversation that was further sealing her fate. The shield of public opinion he had built suddenly seemed flimsy. To the world, she was a hero. To Ricardo Diaz, she was the girl who had hurt his brother and shamed his family. The revelation forced Arthur to reevaluate his strategy. Passive defense was no longer enough. He needed to go on the offensive. But how do you fight an enemy with no face and no address? His fortune, his connections, his corporate power were useless against a man driven by a deep-seated grudge and operating in the cracks of society. The constant tension began to take its toll on them both. Leah, who once saw Arthur as a savior, now also saw him as the epicenter of the earthquake that had shattered her life. She loved him, he knew, but there was a subtle resentment growing in her eyes. Life with him was safe, but it wasn't free. She missed the brutal autonomy of the streets, the simplicity of worrying only about her next meal, not about shadows who had names and reasons to hate her. One afternoon, that tension boiled over. Arthur, frustrated by Cole's lack of progress and paranoid about security, snapped at Leah for opening the door for a pizza delivery guy before he could check the peephole. "I told you never to open the door, Leah." "Never," he yelled, his voice louder than he intended. Leah shrank back, her eyes filling with hurt and anger. "I was hungry, and you were locked in your office again, being scared of everything. At least on the street I could go where I wanted. I didn't have a guard watching me all the time. On the street you almost died, and it was to save me," he shot back, desperation leaking into his voice. "And now I'm dying in here," she screamed back, the tears finally breaking free. "I hate this life. I hate being scared all the time. I wish I'd never thrown that brick." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. "I wish I'd never thrown that brick." The phrase, born of a child's pain and fear, was the cruelest weapon Ricardo Diaz could have possibly used, and he hadn't even needed to be there to wield it. Arthur stood speechless, watching the girl he was fighting so hard to protect turn against the very act that had brought them together. He saw now, with devastating clarity, that it wasn't enough to protect her physically. He had to heal the wounds his protection was inflicting. He knelt in front of her, his pride shattered. "I'm sorry, Leah. You're right. I am scared, and I'm turning my fear into a cage for you. That's going to change, I promise." That night he made a decision. If he couldn't find Ricardo Diaz, he would make Ricardo find him. But this time, it would be on his turf, on his terms. He called Cole. "I have a new plan. Stop looking for Ricardo. We're going to make him come to us, and we're going to be ready." He knew it was a high-risk gamble. He was using Leah as bait, a thought that disgusted him, but it was the only way to end this. He looked at the sleeping girl, an exhausted angel in a war she didn't ask for. "I'm going to fix this, little one," he whispered, "whatever it takes." Arthur's plan was as dangerous as it was simple. Create a routine, a semblance of normalcy, predictable enough to lure Ricardo Diaz into a trap. It was a war of nerves, a line cast into the darkness in the hope that the predator would bite. The decision gnawed at him. Using Leah, even to ultimately protect her, felt like a betrayal of the silent vow he had made to keep her safe. Every forced smile, every casual outing he planned was tainted with guilt. He began taking Leah to a small park near the building every afternoon, always at the same time. The park was open, with few places to hide, and Cole and his small team of discreet operators would be positioned, watching from every angle. At first, Leah was suspicious. The sudden freedom, after weeks of confinement, felt wrong. "Why are we coming here every day?" she asked on the third afternoon, swinging slowly, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a caution no child her age should possess. "Because you were right," Arthur said, sitting on the bench beside her. "You need fresh air. You need to be a kid, and I'm not going to let fear stop me from giving you that anymore." The answer was truthful but incomplete, and he hated the omission. Gradually, however, Leah began to relax. The park routine became a high point of her days. She made friends with other children, laughing with a spontaneity Arthur hadn't heard in weeks. Watching her chase pigeons, her hair flying, her face lit with joy, was both a balm and a torture for him. Every laugh from her raised the stakes. The days turned into a week, and nothing happened. The tension was excruciating. Cole called every night with the same report. No sign of him. All clear. Ricardo's absence was almost more unnerving than his presence. Was he watching? Was he waiting for the perfect moment? Or had he simply given up and disappeared? The uncertainty was a slow poison. Arthur began to doubt his own plan. Perhaps he had been arrogant to think he could predict the movements of a man driven by revenge. Perhaps he was just exposing Leah to needless danger day after day. It was on a Friday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks into the plan, that things changed. The day was grey, threatening rain. The park was emptier than usual. Leah was on a slide, and Arthur was watching her from their usual bench. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. His eyes methodically scanned the perimeter. And then he saw him. Across the street, standing by a newsstand, was a man. He wasn't tall like Ricardo, nor did he have a scar. He was an ordinary, harmless-looking man reading a newspaper, but he wasn't turning the pages. And his eyes weren't on the paper, they were fixed on the park, fixed on Leah. Arthur took out his phone and sent a coded text to Cole. "Observer, newsstand, east." The reply came in seconds. "Spotted, not our guy. Stay calm. Could be a scout." A scout. The gears of the trap were finally turning. Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline and fear. He had to maintain normalcy. Any sign of panic could spook the target. He forced a smile and waved at Leah, who grinned back, oblivious to the gathering storm. The man at the newsstand folded his paper, tucked it under his arm, and began walking slowly, not toward the park, but away from it. Cole's voice whispered in the earpiece Arthur was wearing, "He's on the move. We're on him. Stay put. Maintain the routine." But something was wrong. Arthur felt it in his bones. It was too easy. A single scout, so obvious. It wasn't their style. It was a feint, a distraction. His eyes shot back to the park, scanning every corner, every face. And that's when he saw him. Not across the street, but in the park. An ice cream vendor he had never seen before. He was pushing his cart slowly, approaching the playground area. He was tall, and as he turned slightly to serve a child, the flat afternoon light caught a small white scar next to his left eye. It was Ricardo. And he was less than 30 feet from Leah. Arthur's world contracted, narrowing into a tunnel of dread that had Ricardo Diaz at one end and Leah at the other, the ice cream man. The perfect bait, the camouflage of normalcy. The scout across the street had been a masterstroke. A chess piece moved to draw the eye from the real attack. Cole and his team were blind, chasing a ghost while the wolf entered the pen. For a moment, panic paralyzed Arthur. His muscles locked, his breath caught in his chest. Yell? It would cause a pandemonium, scare Leah, and might give Ricardo the chaos he needed. To grab her and vanish, stay quiet, that would let him get closer. "Cole, it's a misdirect," he hissed into the mic, his voice a taut thread of sound. "Target's in the park. Ice cream vendor. I repeat, the target is in the park." There was no immediate reply. Time stretched, becoming an elastic, torturous substance. Every push of the ice cream cart toward the slide was a thud in Arthur's heart. He stood up, forcing a calm he didn't feel. He had to get to her first. He started walking, hands in his, pockets to hide their shaking, his pace measured so as not to break into a run. "Leah!" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the still air. "Almost time to go." Ricardo heard him. His head snapped in Arthur's direction, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met over the heads of the children. The disguise fell away. The expression on Ricardo's face was no longer that of a friendly vendor. It was a mask of pure, concentrated hatred. He abandoned the cart and took 2 quick steps toward Leah. The silent race had begun. Arthur dropped the facade and ran, the sound of his expensive shoes slapping against the pavement, an alarm that made a few mothers turn. "Leah, get over here, now!" But Ricardo was faster, closer. He reached out to grab Leah's arm. In that moment, the girl, who was about to smile at the vendor, saw his face up close. It wasn't the scar she recognized first, but the look in his eyes. The same empty predatory gaze from her nightmare, the same wrongness, the survival instinct honed by years on the streets screamed inside her. She didn't scream in fear, she screamed in fury and with terrifying clarity. "It's him, the man from the picture, help!" The cry tore through the air, specific and accusatory. It wasn't the wail of a frightened child, it was the pointing finger of a witness. For a moment, Ricardo hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the accusation. That hesitation was all Arthur needed. He didn't think. He acted. He launched himself forward with the force of desperation and crashed into Ricardo, sending them both tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The scene exploded into chaos. Children cried, parents yelled, and suddenly anonymous figures who had been pedestrians or newspaper readers converged on the spot. It was Cole's team, finally in action. They swarmed the scuffle, pulling Arthur away and subduing Ricardo with brutal, quiet efficiency. Arthur scrambled to his feet, breathless, his body aching, adrenaline singing in his veins. His only thought was Leah. He saw her, huddled by the slide, trembling from head to toe, but her eyes were locked on him. He ran to her and swept her into his arms, pulling her tight against his chest. The sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer. The nightmare was ending. He held her tight, feeling her small, shaking body against his, and in the cacophony of screams and sirens, he heard only the beat of her heart, a rhythm that was now, irrevocably, the rhythm of his own life. The sirens, once a distant alarm, now became the sound of salvation. The arrival of police and an ambulance turned the chaos into an orderly procedure. Paramedics checked on Arthur and Leah, who refused to let go of his hand. He had scrapes and a bruise already, forming on his cheek, but he felt no pain. All he could feel was the shaking of Leah's body, which he held as if she were made of glass. Ricardo Diaz and the scout were led away in separate squad cars, their faces impassive, defeated. Cole approached, his face grim, but with a nod that said, "It's over." At the precinct, the atmosphere was different from the first time. There was no late-night confusion, but a tense calm, the hum of a successful operation. Helen was already there, her presence a rock of competence and tranquility. While Arthur gave his statement, with her at his side, a kind social worker named Clara took Leah into a private room to talk. Arthur hesitated, the instinct to not leave her alone, screaming inside him, but Clara's gaze was professional and compassionate. "It's for her own good, Mr. Vance. We need to understand what she wants, what she needs." While he waited, Helen brought him the news. Ricardo's confession had been an avalanche. Pressured by the capture in the act and the prospect of a long sentence, he gave up everything. The criminal network was exactly what Cole had suspected. an organization that controlled territories through extortion and intimidation, led by a man known only as the Janitor. Arthur's kidnapping hadn't been random, he was a high-value target. Leah's interference was a humiliation the organization couldn't tolerate, and Ricardo and Marcos's quest for revenge had aligned perfectly with the network's need to make an example. With the confession, warrants were issued. The operation that unfolded that night dismantled the organization's backbone. The fear that had held their power in place dissolved the moment they were exposed, but the victory over the criminals seemed secondary to Arthur. His true verdict was being decided in that room next door. His mind raced, imagining the future, shelters, foster homes, the bureaucracy of the system. He was ready to fight, to move heaven and earth, to use all his influence and wealth not to lose her. When Clara emerged from the room, her expression was soft. "She's an extraordinary girl," she said, "strong, smart, and very clear about what she wants." Arthur's heart stopped. "And what does she want?" Clara smiled. "She told me everything, about the streets, the pastries, the brick, the fear, and then I asked her where she felt safe, where her home was." Clara paused, looking Arthur directly in the eye. "She didn't point to a place on a map. She pointed to the door of the room you were in and said, 'I want to stay with Arthur. He's my home.'" A wave of emotion so overwhelming hit Arthur that he had to brace himself against the wall. All the battles, all the fear, all the anguish of the last few weeks had culminated in that one moment, in that simple, powerful sentence. He hadn't saved her. They had saved each other. When Leah came out of the room, she ran to him and hugged him tightly. There was no more trembling, just a firm, secure hold. On the way home, a comfortable silence filled the car. The city outside looked the same, but for them everything had changed. The threat had dissipated. Fear had given way to a quiet certainty. Arthur looked at the girl beside him, who had finally fallen asleep, her head resting on his arm. She was no longer a burden, a responsibility, or a cause. She was his daughter. The conflict was over. A new life was just beginning. 6 weeks later, the penthouse apartment was no longer a sanctuary of silence and solitude, but a home that hummed with the energy of new life. Leah's adoption process, fast-tracked by the case's notoriety, and Ellen's intervention was in its final stages, a formality that would simply put on paper what their hearts already knew to be true. The janitor's criminal network had been completely dismantled, the Diaz brothers facing long sentences, and peace, once an abstract concept for Arthur and Leah, had become the texture of their days. Leah now read entire books by herself, her laughter echoing through hallways that had once known only the footsteps of a lonely man. The transformation was visible in her, in the healthy glow of her skin, in the confidence with which she took up space in the world. But the greatest change had occurred within Arthur. He was no longer the man who had walked out of that late-night meeting. The control he had so prized was replaced by a vulnerable surrender to love. His empire, once the center of his identity, was now just a tool for a greater purpose. In his immaculate home office, in place of a business award, there now rested on a velvet pedestal a crude, imperfect object, the brick. It was a daily reminder, not of his fragility, but of the strength that can emerge from the most unexpected places. Inspired by their journey, he had established the Leah Foundation, a comprehensive and aggressively funded program not to build buildings, but to create real, immediate safety nets for children on the streets, with rapid response teams, secure shelters, and above all, a promise that no child who asked for help would be lost to bureaucracy. It was his new legacy. That Thursday afternoon, he picked Leah up from school. She ran toward him, her book-filled backpack bouncing, her face radiant. "Dad, can we go by that place?" she asked in the car, a question she asked every so often. He smiled. Of course we can. He drove to the parking garage, the same one where it all began, but the place was unrecognizable. The asphalt had been repaved, the walls painted, and a series of powerful LED floodlights bathed every corner in a bright, clear light, eliminating all shadows. High-definition cameras, visible and deterrent, monitored every entrance and exit. It was a symbol of his own transformation. Where there was once danger, he had built safety. They got out of the car and walked hand in hand across the now bright concrete. Arthur stopped at the exact spot where the dark van had been parked. "Do you remember this place, Leah?" She looked around, her eyes large and serene. There was no fear in them, only memory. "I remember, but it doesn't scare me anymore. It's just a place." She then pointed to the corner across the street. "That's where I used to stand, waiting for the nice man in the nice car." Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He knelt in front of her, getting down to her eye level. That, men didn't know it, but he was the one who was waiting for a hero to save him. Leah beamed, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face. She hugged him tightly, and in that embrace, in the middle of the transformed parking garage, the circle was complete. Arthur Vance had learned that true wealth wasn't in his vaults, but in the courage to fight for the one who saved him. And Leah, the girl who threw a brick to protect kindness, discovered that the bravest act of her life had not only saved a man, but had built for herself the home she had always dreamed of. The greatest heroism, they both understood, lies not in the absence of fear, but in the decision to act in spite of it, proving that sometimes the smallest hands can rebuild the world.